No,
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tuli Martinez. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. We're letting people log in. We're about halfway through. We have over 200 people joining us this morning, so I'm really grateful for all of you and your openness and willingness to join us this morning. So I'm watching people come in the door virtually, so we'll get through this in a minute. Let's see. We'll get started shortly. I think we have a critical mass. So good morning, everyone. I'm Tuli Martinez, Vice President of Programs and Conferences. I lead the Healthcare Funders Group. We've been working together for many, many years. And this year we've been able to really get down to the root causes of a lot of issues in health that we have kind of been talking about from time to time. But now really narrowing in and focusing on the true causes of how systemic racism really impacts the mental health and health of our communities of color. I am so pleased to have this amazing panel and my thought partner, Casey Patterson, who has been working with me on this webinar. I am so grateful to you for advising me through this and working with me. And with that, I welcome everyone and I'll turn it over to Casey. Thank you, everyone.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Tuli. Thank you to SCG as well for your willingness to bring these conversations to our community, your willingness to be bold and courageous as we have these conversations. So welcome. It's good to see all you in the virtual room. I know that we'll have a chance to talk and interact in a bit. And I want to just remind everybody to please drop your questions throughout the presentations into the Q&A, and we will grab them when we get into the panel discussion. So we will interject your questions in with the questions that I've prepared for the panel. So good morning, as Tuli mentioned, I'm Casey Patterson. I know many of you, so hello to those of you I know, and nice to meet you to those that I don't know. And many of you participated in the last Health Funders Group Peer Learning session in May, where I also moderated a conversation about the impact of racism on infant and maternal mortality. You heard then from Dr. Debbie Allen in the Department of Public Health. She shared some research documenting the physiological toll that racism takes on a woman's body and her unborn fetus that lead to their premature deaths. And since June, in the aftermath of the world witnessing a peace officer murder George Floyd, the outcry against police brutality and systemic racism has reached such decibels that counties across the country have declared racism a public health crisis. And while we may know and understand on an intellectual level that racism has negative impacts on individuals and communities of color, we may not know exactly how racism broadly or systemic racism more specifically harms our collective public health. That's a fairly new and nuanced conversation. And so today we have the awesome privilege of hearing from a panel of experts who will really help us to unpack how systemic racism impacts individual and community well-being. But first, a call to action from our first speaker, Jay Canas, who serves as a senior administrative analyst for the Department of Mental Health and UCLA Public Partnership for Wellbeing. Following Jay, we'll have presentations from both Dr. Erica Bath and Stephanie Telecki before opening our panel discussion to also include Reverend Sam Casey and Felicia Jones. Proper introductions for all of them to follow, but first let's hear from Jay.
Thank you, Casey, for the introduction, and thank you, Tuli, for this opportunity. And I want to actually thank you, all of you, for allowing my energy in your spaces today. I may know some of you out there. I know most of you that know me have not seen me since the beginning of my transition, which began in early 2019. So if you thought I was loud before, my new voice is much louder now, literally and figuratively speaking. But to most of you, if not all of you, what you're about to hear will be very new to you about me. It may be uncomfortable, It may spark something unexpected. If that does happen, you and I are now connected, even though only looking through a screen. Every single one of you that I have crossed paths with has taught me a lesson. I have learned a little about you, about myself, about the spaces we're both a part of, but most importantly for me, about how I fit in, if at all. To all of you whom I have never met, I am Jay, and by the age of 9, I became a sexual abuse survivor. By the age of 12, a torture survivor. By the age of 14, a suicide attempt survivor. By 16, a runaway. After being disowned by my faith community, I ran away from a place called home and ran into the arms of a system we call foster care. A dropout by the age of 18, emancipated youth by almost 20, homeless by 21, and pronounced dead 7 years ago. I am a child and an adult disowned by the people that created me and the institutions and systems I have continued to interact with every day of my existence. I am Jay, a child raised by systems and institutions you may be a part of, and an adult product of those services delivered. I was also prepared with a PowerPoint today about equality versus equity and how inclusion will ultimately lead to a liberation of a people. But a dear mentor of mine, Gita, was like, please no, not one more PowerPoint. Don't get me wrong, we have some really fantastic presentations today. But as I reflect about what she said and why she said it, which happens every time she shares her wisdom with me, I realized that what she meant for me to understand is I need to stop always trying to prove something to everyone and just be myself. You see, I have always craved an Ivy League education. It took me over 20 years to earn my bachelor's degree since my emancipation from the system. After the life I have lived, I find myself thinking that maybe with a Harvard or Yale degree, maybe, just maybe, people will not think twice when deciding whether to share and allow me in their space or not. What I learned at McLaren Hall and why I'm still alive today is that I have to fight for my respect by any means necessary. I've had to fight through to maintain the strong persona here that you see in front of you. I have ensured that what you see first is my tough skin, my don't mess with me postures, my tattoos, so you don't see the scars beneath the ink. I have ensured that what you hear is my loud voice and not the cowering child I will forever keep healing inside of me. What I want you to see is that I can look at you in the eye without looking away, and that my ideas and words are worthy of notice so I can feel included. What I don't allow you to see is my tortured soul, working through my narratives every day, every moment I am triggered by a memory. So why would I not want to prove something if that is the only way people will feel safe allowing me in their spaces? People have stared at me with confusion and discussed my whole life. I am a brown, Latinx, trans, disabled Salvadorian American with PTSD, bipolar, manic depressive with psychotic symptoms, and this too is a daily struggle. I'm a recovering addict, and I welcome my death every morning I wake up and every night I go to sleep. I am also a UCLA Bruin, and soon to be a double Bruin, class of 22. I almost didn't become one, however, having attempted suicide again 6 months before graduation while at UCLA, had I not been supported by campus community leaders, the Guardian Scholars Program, and by a strong Black woman, dear to my heart, who sadly ended up committing suicide herself. But everything that I have survived and faced, live every moment as if it were your last, is the mantra that my heart beats to. This is my narrative. However, this is neither the meaning of my life nor my purpose, and I continue to rewrite my narrative. My personal legend, my philosophy, is to learn and never stop learning about what destroys the human spirit and how to heal from it. This global, national, and city unrest doesn't come from 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It comes from centuries of a need to the necks of Black lives, brown folks, Native, Indigenous, all communities of color, and all still struggling to survive, evident by the continual and consistent poor health and lack of justice outcomes in these communities. The poignant symbol of a knee on Mr. Floyd's neck and the horrific manner of his death is a symbol of what systems of so-called care have done for centuries and continue to do to us Black, brown, and all folks still struggling to not only survive but thrive today. People are angry with this ignored injustice, torture, and treatment. I am angry. This one death that would have gone unnoticed has instead become a symbol of all of our intolerance of this ignored bigotry. And as this year continues to unfold, I'm learning that even violence is becoming an elitist privilege. What continues to be confirmed by this experience is what I've always felt, and that is that I cannot trust my own government and systems meant to protect me. However, at this very moment, today, you and I, we are all going through this experience together. We are not only living through a pandemic, we're living through a world war and an American civil war between a people and their existing republic. So what this will require us to do is to either begin or continue creating safe spaces to formulate a strategic community building response. Community uplifting, community empowerment, community healing. I am the community, but I am also now a part of the village. Every single one of you here today is a part of this village. This will take all of us thought leaders at different levels to partner and connect at a higher, deeper level, starting now with community members like myself and different from me. Change and healing will come from the community interwoven with those in positions of power and authority. If what we want to address is systemic oppression, who more qualified to understand the dynamics, redefine them, and offer solutions and partnership with you than those ingrained in the day-to-day realities of those specific communities? I am here today because of people. I am here because I have my village taking care of me, supporting me and holding me up through the challenges and the accomplishments. I am here because I have finally found stability, housing, some financial, but most importantly, mental stability, because people, tools, and mechanisms I learn and research and begin to modify to maintain an existence I have struggled with. I am here because even though I will never know what it's like to have a caring and nurturing, loving mother and father, or a family unit society deems qualified, I know what it's like to be cared for, supported, and acknowledged. I am here being listened by all of you because of the opportunities I have been given by my many positive role models, some in this audience today, and the many strangers that are now my dearest friends that feed me, talk with me, love me, and teach me. This patched up and scarred individual you see in front of your screen today has required hundreds of lives to work together, apart, yet together to keep me standing. So to all of you, you know who you are, thank you. I am here because you have allowed me to be here. There is no going back, and there is no going back to normal. I don't want to go back to that energy. There is no going back, and there's no power to bring back to the people. We have never had it. But between you and I, one of us is better positioned to share wealth. A wealth of knowledge, a wealth of character, a wealth of opportunity. Fund us if you need our help, so we too can also create for our own and for others. I have started these conversations with individuals in your spaces, and I'm sharing their voices with you today, because your voices must also be heard. There are many visionaries doing the work right now, many of you here today. Connectivity, empathy, patience, compassion, understanding, authenticity. Today is the first step to this process, and it is a beautiful thing to share with you today. I feel your energies, and I hope you can feel mine. Ironically, it will not be our acronyms next to our names that will matter the most here today, but rather our interpersonal tool belt in order to connect on a deeper and higher level. I have needed to remove my ego and my pride and allow your wisdom in. We are all positioned to fundamentally challenge the assumptions that are crafting these systems and recreate what is omnipresent. Our responses need to change to what we fear what we don't understand, and what we feel threatened by. And if they don't, we need to create the appropriate ways to hold people accountable to get the results we need. We learn by doing. You will actually know you are on the right path by how many mistakes you're making. We need to energize, organize, and sync our communal rhythm, because what we start today will have a ripple effect. So I now leave you with this to ruminate in your mind. It is much easier to destroy someone than to build someone up. I challenge us, every single one of us here today, to use our power for healing. I invite you with me today to take personal responsibility and accountability, because it must first start with the self. We must become aware and ask ourselves, what are the narratives every single one of us is feeding from? What are the tools and mechanisms we are providing for those in positions of power and authority? We need to arm ourselves to build up individuals and the communities we serve. Are you prepared to get uncomfortable? Ask yourself, how are you uplifting individuals in your teams and organizations now, before today? What are you willing to lose and sacrifice to make this change happen? Discover your limitations. How much power are you willing to share, if you have it, in the name of justice, equity, and solidarity? And once we have these answers, we're going to have to share them and define these things together before we operationalize them. Starting now, we need to position people as experts in their own teaching, learning, and healing. It is going to require both a left wing and a right wing for us to fly. Positive and healing energy to you all. Thank you.
Jay, thank you so much. Your story has left me both breathless and hopeful. And thank you so much for inviting us to be part of your community, for being part of our village. And together today, we're going to begin to build that communal rhythm. So thank you so much. I want to invite Dr. Erica Bath to lift us up now to the 30,000-foot view and walk us through the evidence that supports the declaration of racism as a public health crisis. Dr. Bath is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA, where she also serves as the vice chair for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Dr. Bath.
Thank you. Is Bethany going to, yes, great. And I'll just tell you, I'll say next slide. So racism is a public health crisis, and we're here today to really understand how systemic racism impacts health. An artist that I follow, his name is Patrick Martinez, and he's very social justice minded, and he has a new series of these peachy folders, which is a bit of a throwback, but he highlights how racism doesn't rest in a pandemic. Next slide. Next slide. So systemic racism in the United States. Systemic racism is really in every structure that we have. It's the systematic institutionalization of racism and policies designed to support it. So whether we're looking at housing discrimination, which includes things like redlining, restrictive, racially restrictive covenants, food deserts, thinking about unequal school funding, thinking about our police and criminal justice system, whether it's mandatory sentencing, racial profiling, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, or even things like zip codes determining health outcomes. This is how racism ends up being systemic in nature. Next slide, please. And so it really also has to do with historically accumulated white privilege and how that is upheld by national values, and it preserves the gaps between white Americans and Americans of color. Next slide. When we think about this in relationship to COVID-19, we need to think about how and where people are positioned. And so if we think about who are the essential workers, who are disproportionately racial and ethnic minoritized populations, where they're living in terms of the types of housing that they may have, the barriers to being able to access services, testing. All of these relate to the disproportionate impact this pandemic is having on Black and brown bodies. Next slide. So there's two concepts that I want people to walk away with today. One is by the Dr. Arlene Geronimus, and she talks about this concept of weathering. And so we spoke earlier about systemic racism being in every institution, but there are biological effects to systemic racism that are actually happening at the cellular level. And really what ends up happening is that this ongoing, constant and persistent need to be coping with, adversity of all types really has an impact on our health, and it has an impact at the cellular level. So in the top right, you'll see the chromosomes, and each chromosome that we have, X chromosomes, have something called a telomere. Well, these telomeres end up getting shortened or weathered by having to cope with constant stress. Next slide. The other term that I want people to keep in mind is the term of allostasis or allostatic load. And this really reflects the cumulative index of multibiological aging. And so with the weathering comes this sort of increased allostatic load. Normally, stress is something that we as humans are very adaptive to. However, if you have stress going 24/7, 365, which is the case of systemic racism, because you have stress from all different sources, whether it's housing, education, healthcare access, unequal treatment once you're there, this can end up really sort of taxing our biological systems and things begin to break down. Next slide. So allostatic load burden and racial disparities are associated with increased morbidity and mortality. Normally, when faced with a threat, the body produces hormones and other signals that turn on systems that are necessary for flight or fight. If you're having this turned on all the time, you end up kind of burning out your organs, and there's rapid wear and tear on body organs. And many people have hypothesized that one of the reasons why Black and brown people, particularly those who are under 40, or under 50, are having increased death due to COVID is this inflammatory response. And so maybe some of you have heard about the cytokine storm that are happening, and you see really young Black and brown people disproportionately, like in their 40s, dying. It's hypothesized in part that due to the allostatic load, this constant sort of overactive inflammatory response is what's really hurting people in their lungs. Next slide. So thinking about systemic racism and health disparities, there's almost no illness that we can talk about that doesn't disproportionately affect Black people in terms of morbidity, mortality, and whether it's, thinking about early psychosis and being more likely to have police contact, or breast cancer survival rates, or surgical outcomes, or being able to access pain medication while in the hospital, or when people are diagnosed, or maternal child health, there's significantly worse morbidity and mortality. And this is due to systemic racism, and systemic racism also impacts interactions with physicians and provider bias. Next slide, please. So I would be remiss if we didn't link what's really been happening, and really primed us to be having this conversation, is police brutality and racism. Next slide. I think a slide got skipped, but so timeline of police violence. Police violence really is a public health issue, and as we're seeing the violence from law enforcement, it really has its histories in the slave patrols. The earliest form of American law enforcement was actually slave patrols, which were created to establish a system of terror in response to slave uprisings and runaway slaves. After the slave patrols during Reconstruction, there were Black codes, and these were really, precursors to Jim Crow but were very much more forthright in terms of limiting Black folks' access to labor, wages, voting rights. But all of these different laws over time have been maintained by a racially supremacist structure, really by the police. And so we see this going all the way through mass incarceration and school to prison pipeline. Next slide. So really, police brutality is a public health crisis. It's a leading cause of death for young men in the US, and 1 out of every 1,000 Black men can be expected to be killed by police. So not only is this a public health issue in terms of like who's dying, but also in terms of the collective insult to communities where police brutality is also causing pain, suffering, and long-term disability. Next slide. And so it's making Black people sick. So whether we think about injuries or the types of physiological stress due to having to cope with police brutality in our communities, dealing with racist public reactions that cause stress. So hearing our leadership, our Attorney General, how he's speaking about Jacob Blake and his family, that causes stress. The arrests, incarcerations, and bills also cause financial stress on families. So if they don't kill you, the constant siege of, no-knock warrants, search and seizure, those also all are part of an integrated system of oppression that cause disempowerment, and they have effects on our health. Next slide. A study that was recently done actually showed how police killings, and particularly that of unarmed Black men, have negative effects on Black mental health. And so there's a higher number of negative poor mental health days for Black communities when an unarmed Black person is killed. Next slide. In terms of lynching and health, there's an interesting study by Probst who really looked at communities that had lynching in the past. So she looked at different county level data, and those with higher levels of lynching actually had long-term negative effects on housing patterns and incarceration, particularly amongst Black communities. Next slide. Police killings also have negative education effects on Black and brown youth. So in the days immediately after police killing, there's higher rates of absenteeism by Black and brown students. They're more likely to be classified with an emotional disturbance and twice as likely to feel unsafe in their neighborhoods. So you're seeing the systemic nature of police violence. Next slide. Next slide, please. In terms of psychological stress, each episode of police brutality has emotional and physiological effects on individuals. So whether it is we're witnessing or experiencing harassment or seeing deaths and brutality go unchecked and unpunished, the message to Black communities is that our bodies are police property, disposable, and undeserving of dignity and justice. And this has negative health effects at the individual level and on communities. Next. And there's a expression of womb to tomb that many of the negative health effects actually end up affecting our offspring. And one of the, a recent study actually looked at pregnant Black moms and the anticipatory anxiety due to added demands on the hypervigilance needed to really be parenting while Black can have negative effects, not only on the mother, but also be passed down to her offspring. Next slide. There's a term I started to use called racism pornography, and this really relates to the sort of omnipresent imaging that we're seeing of Black police brutality on Black bodies. And so showing the image of George Floyd over and over again, or Rayshard Brooks, these are very difficult and can be triggering, and particularly since they're happening in context with really unchecked police violence. And so it's important to be mindful around these images. So even though we need to have them and to document them, and thank God for speed journalism, we have to also be responsible in terms of how media is using them and portraying them. There's no other deaths that we see with such omnipresence as we see Black death, right? And so that's a problem. Next slide. And I think gaslighting by society makes trauma worse, right? So we're seeing these images over and over again as a way of documenting our truth, but then nothing is happening. People look for other reasons to sort of malign the victim. And so this also contributes to feelings of dehumanization. Next slide. And so James Baldwin talks about people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. And so, you know, these experiences are very much part of how we sort of live and navigate through space, and they're within our bodies. And they're in white bodies and Black bodies, both the privilege and the burden of systemic racism. Next slide. So moving forward and thinking about key principles for mental health intervention, we have to recognize the ways in which police brutality is inextricably tied to racism and it is a public health issue. And it really results in two types of human impact, both at the individual and community level. And so we really need to think both about individuals and communities in terms of thinking about interventions. Next slide. Thinking about a trauma and resilience informed response to dueling pandemics. One of the things is to reduce the long-term and costly cumulative consequences of systemic racism. We need to be trauma informed and anchored in community. And that means really thinking about those different systems, right? So creating opportunities for workforce development, early engagement, partnering, and co-piling with people. And as Jay talked about so eloquently, is figuring out how are we going to build up people, structures, and communities. Next slide. And so one of the things, one of my mentors, Dr. Kamara Jones, who's a critical race scholar, really asked us, you know, now everyone's reading Dr. Ibram Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist, and that's part of, I think, our charge, and really to question these structures and think about how is racism operating here. We know that's going to be operating in every nook and cranny of our society, but for those of us who have the positionality to be change agents, we need to sort of constantly be reflective and thinking about structures, policies, practices, and norms and values, and challenge them. Next slide. And so there's something that I'd like to offer is this rationale for targeted universalism. And it dovetails in some ways with critical race theory that talks about centering the margins and really thinking about groups that are performing differently and really disaggregating goals to really have a more equity focus to help those groups. And so really by understanding different structures that either are facilitators or barriers to success or wellness, and then develop and implement targeted approaches for different groups, and they're not going to all look the same. Next. So I just like to thank my team, my mentoring team for this opportunity and for helping me sort of think about conceptually how to present this story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bath. So much to unpack, and I'm glad that we have a chance to do so in the panel discussion and Q&A. And I want to remind everybody to please drop questions for our panelists into the Q&A, into the chat, and we will grab them and interweave them in our discussion. Next, I want to turn it over to Stephanie Telecki. Dr. Bath talked a little bit about how racism is operating, how systemic racism is operating. And I want to ask Stephanie to sort of zero in on the healthcare system here. Stephanie is the Director of Learning and Impact at the California Healthcare Foundation. She also directs the foundation's maternity care investments. Stephanie, I'm going to ask you to please share more about the foundation's birth equity work and specifically about the levers you're focused on pulling at the systems level of care. Stephanie, I want to turn it over to you and give us a little bit more about how you as a funder are approaching this work.
Thank you, and I want to make sure that you can hear me since I had tech difficulties. Yes, great.
You sound
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you what the California Healthcare Foundation has been working on in the field of birth equity for Black mothers and birthing people. Over the next 10 minutes, I hope to share with you a little about the California Healthcare Foundation and a little about what and how we are funding in the birth equity space. And I hope that this will be a useful case study, especially for foundation staff who are in the audience. I want to note from the outset that we as an organization and I as the lead program staff of our maternity care portfolio approach this work with much humility. The work is really hard, as we just heard from Dr. Bath and Jay, to undo decades of racism, neglect, and harm. We know that many others have been working on this issue a lot longer than we have. So again, we're coming with humility. We know that we will make mistakes, and we already have made some mistakes, and we need to own them. And we know that our story is just one funder's story. It's just one vehicle for your contemplation this morning, and hopefully it will spark good discussion and questions. Next slide, please. And you can go to the next one too. So now I just want to share a little about California Healthcare Foundation, just so you kind of know where I'm coming from. Here's some just key facts and figures. We are an independent nonprofit philanthropy. We are what's known as a conversion foundation. That means our funding came from when Blue Cross went for profit. And we were created, and also the California Endowment out of those funds. We have no affiliation with Blue Cross. We are independent, but that's just where our money came from. And we focus on two key things. The healthcare system. We are one of only a few foundations in California that really have the healthcare system at its focus. And I want to note that we are not confused about the fact that healthcare only accounts for a very small part of overall health. We are focused on the healthcare system because we know that we spend, waste, and cause a lot of harm via the healthcare system. And so it's an area that needs attention. The other thing that we focus on, or the sort of overarching frame for our funding, is that we focus on the Medi-Cal population and uninsured. We have three key goal areas: access to care and coverage, which was all about ACA expansion, about improving the Medi-Cal program, and also holding Medi-Cal accountable. We have a unit called High Value Care, which is where our maternity care work sits. And then we have overarching projects and funding called Laying the Foundation, which includes the reports that many of you might know us for, so sort of a lot of the analytic work, and also things like the funding that we do of healthcare journalists in the state, and kind of big collaboratives with clinics and things like that. And all in all, we give away about $30 million annually across all of the different topics that I just named. And we give away about $2 million in the maternity care portfolio. So, i.e., that's not a lot in the face of the challenges, so we have to be very strategic. Okay, hold on, something got, this is not my slide deck. Can you show the next slide? That's the slide I want, thanks. As I noted, we have about $1 million annually that we are putting to birth equity to make change in the state. And as you know, California is a huge state, so that's not very much money when we're trying to have impact. So we have to be very strategic. So we approach our work by thinking about the change we want to see in the world. And in this case, it's decreased maternal morbidity and mortality for Black mothers and birthing people. So we think about the levers that we have for change as a philanthropy. And that's kind of the flower diagram you see on the right, sort of the change we want in the middle and the different levers that need to be pulled. You need to pull more levers than just one typically. We're usually thinking about multiple levers. We try to figure out which levers are most important and invest there. And we do that in deep consultation with our partners. To these levers, we bring our capabilities as an organization. That's the left side of the slide. So we are investing in things like our funding, of course, which is what philanthropy is all about. Also investments, not grants. So we make investments in different enterprises. Research that we fund, communications, and also convenings. And convenings are actually one of our most powerful tools as a philanthropy. They often don't cost that much, but they can be very impactful. So we know that these may not be all of the capabilities and levers that are needed, but it's what we have found that we as a philanthropy can best contribute and where we can hopefully add value. Next slide, please. So the point of this slide is just to say that a few years ago, we named equity explicitly as a criteria by which we would assess opportunities. So for every time that we're thinking about a new portfolio or a new project, we are really thinking about how equity plays into it and really should be at the core of what we're doing. Next slide, please. And you can go to the next one as well. So now I just want to dig in deep to our birth equity and healthcare portfolio specifically, and kind of building on Dr. Bath's presentation, why this portfolio, why this work? Well, for starters, Black birthing people are 3 to 4 times, Dr. Bath had 5 times, so there's different statistics, up to 5 times as likely to die as all other races from pregnancy and birth-related causes. And Black women and birthing people are 2 times as likely to experience a severe maternal morbidity. Black birthing people are only 5% of the birthing population, but experience 20% of the deaths and are 10 to 14% of the severe morbidities. These are staggering numbers. These are numbers that we do not accept in other areas of healthcare and of public health. So that's the problem statement. Importantly, we know that these differences cannot be explained away by factors like health status of the mother or income or education or any other factor that many people want to fill in the blank there. We have done the studies on those, and we know that those are not the reasons that we are seeing these disparities. Racism and not race is a key factor in these disparities. So this portfolio that CHCF supports is about addressing healthcare quality differences that are unacceptable and that stem in large part from unwarranted differential care of Black birthing people. Next slide, please. So a couple more words by way of background on the portfolio. We are focused explicitly on the mother, not the child, and that is very deliberate. It is not that we don't care about children or infants at all. It is that mothers and birthing people are usually the group that is just left out of the equation and not focused on and not appreciated. So we partner, we really focus on the mother as the core sort of vehicle in which to improve both maternal and infant health, hopefully, and family health. We partner with those most impacted by the inequities, who know the challenges and possibilities of solution most deeply, and we heard that obviously from Jay especially. Our current portfolio is about 75 to 80% invested in either Black leads at organizations like universities or in Black-led community-based organizations. And as I mentioned before, we come to this work with a tremendous amount of humility and knowing that we will not always get it right. And when we don't, we have to fix that and move forward and learn. There are many challenges to this work. It is hard to combat systemic racism. It's deeply ingrained, as we heard from Dr. Bath. As a funder, we have to care about contribution, not attribution, because it's going to take all of us and then some to do this work. Foundations are often not good at that part. We want often attribution, and this is a contribution situation. And many of our usual partners, like universities, though well-meaning, are often not set up to do community work in a lot of their policies and practices in terms of working with subcontractors and grantees. And I'm happy to say more about that later. We really have to think about our partners in this. And lastly, I would say that white people really have to step up. We created this problem. Science has shown again and again that the differences are not because Black birthing people are sicker or less responsible. The differences are because a white dominant society treats Black people differently in the healthcare setting. So the dominant culture has to work and be part of these solutions. Next slide, please. So I want to just sort of wrap by telling you a little bit more deeply to help make it real about, and I'm not sure, hold on a second. Apologies, I'm looking at this. Okay, good. I want to try to help make it real about what we're actually funding. So I mentioned the levers earlier. To date, we will not exclusively focus on these, but to date in the portfolio, which is only about 12 to 18 months old, we have focused on 3 of the key levers: data, delivery system interventions, and patient and community engagement and voice. So this slide is really all about the data lever. And just to give you a flavor of some of the projects we're funding, we are funding the development of a patient-reported experience measure and survey to enable feedback loops from patients to hospital staff working. We are working with Dr. Karen Scott at UCSF on this. And this is really, Black women are dying because they are not being heard and treated with respect. This survey is a tool to help make that concrete so that hospitals can use that information to improve care in very concrete ways. We are also supporting the community-based organization Black Women for Wellness to provide input to the California Department of Public Health. That, for the first time in 30 years, will be issuing a report on Black maternal and infant mortality. And this is a project really about bringing community voice to a state report and making sure that those voices are incorporated into how the state is thinking about reporting data and how it will act. A second lever, and you can go to the next slide, is the delivery system interventions. This is all about the front lines of care. And so here, I just want to emphasize that, or give some examples of a few things that we funded in this space. One are online educational modules to educate providers in implicit bias and racism, and specifically in the labor and delivery context. So this is in support of Senate Bill 464, which some of you may be aware of. This was known as the implicit bias bill in the obstetric and hospital setting. And this work is being led by a Black scholar at University of Minnesota, Dr. Rachel Hardiman, and we're working with a group called Diversity Science on that, who Dr. Hardiman is partnering with. We also have funded a virtual doula pilot, which seems a little bit like an oxymoron because doula care is so hands-on. But this is in several counties in California, including LA, and is in response to COVID. We're working with the community-based organization Diversity Uplift on this and really trying to understand in times of COVID and beyond, what does it look like to provide virtual care. And lastly, in the delivery system space, we are funding the development of materials to educate policymakers and other key decision makers about what is a doula and how can doulas help address racial disparities. And for this, with this, we're working with the National Health Law Program. So here we are not allowed to lobby as a foundation, but we are trying to produce materials that can help inform key decision makers and hopefully help them make better, more equitable decisions about what's funded through government means. And then next slide, please. The third lever that I will speak about that we've been funding in is around patient and community engagement and voice. And here, I think we have 3 terrific examples of things that we're trying to do in this space. We are funding EARTH, which stands for Birth Without the B for Bias. And it's a Yelp-like platform to solicit feedback from birthing people of color, notably Black mothers. And we are working with the journalist Kimberly Seals Allers on this project. And it was to launch in Sacramento right when COVID struck, so it's a little delayed, but it's moving forward in California, and we're really excited about that. If anyone's interested in other parts of the state, would love to talk to you. We are also funding Kimberly on a podcast series on joyful Black births. This is helping, hopefully, to shift the narrative and make known that positive Black birth experiences are possible and what they look like. And then finally, another example of this kind of work is that we are funding a group called Hollywood Health and Society at University of Southern California to educate TV writers so that they can incorporate more accurate depictions of birth equity and maternal mental health, which is our other area of focus, into their stories. And here we're working, again, with Hollywood, and this kind of TV programming can reach millions and millions of people, way more than we could as a foundation via TV programming and also film. Next slide, please. So that's where we are to date, and more to come. More details can be found at the link shown. I want to make a shameless plug here for to all the funders in the audience out there. There are simply not enough funders in the birth equity space or in the equity space in general, certainly not in healthcare, especially not one focused on Black mothers and birthing people. At most, this country seems to care about babies, and I know that's important, but not about the women and the birthing people who birth them. So I really invite you to join me on this journey as a funder. We don't have enough resources to meet all the needs and to fund all the fantastic work that is happening out there, and so I need co-funders in this journey. I'm also always looking for I think if my email's not there, I'm happy to send it to you. But yes, it's there. Please reach out. And then finally, in closing, I just want to say the moment is really now to address longstanding inequities and systemic racism once and for all, everywhere that they exist in this country. We are focused on the healthcare system. That's one system that has these deep problems and challenges, and there are many, many others, of course. We just simply have to do this. As a society, we must care about each other. We are not decent human beings if we don't. So doing the healthcare equity work, and in my case, the birth equity work, is fundamentally, to me, about being decent and about valuing all human lives equally. That is what motivates me in this work, and I hope what, at least in part, will motivate you, and especially the funders in the audience, to join in and be part of hopefully, what will be solutions. Thank you so much for your time.
Stephanie, thank you so much. And it's been such a pleasure to get to know you over the past year or so as you all have been embarking upon this work. Many of you know that I'm involved with the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment, where we are also very heavily involved with the LA County African American Infant and Maternal Mortality Prevention Initiative. So it's been a real pleasure to be in a collaborative thought partnership space with you, Stephanie. I'm looking forward to digging into this conversation even more. And with that, I want to turn it over to our panel and invite all of our panelists in. And I'm going to begin with introducing Reverend Sam Casey and Felicia Jones, two leaders who I can say without compromise are changing California. Reverend Casey is the Executive Director of Congregations Organized for Prophetic Engagement, a grassroots faith-based organization in San Bernardino. Felicia is COPE's Associate Director and Chief Strategist. San Bernardino was the first county in California to declare racism a public health crisis, and did so as a direct result of COPE's decades-long organizing and advocacy. The first question is for the two of you. One, I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about COPE and tell us how this county declaration evolved from your early work as public health organizers. Sam, we'll start with you and then kick it to Felicia.
Yes, thank you so much. I must say that I'm so honored to be in this space with all of you, and to those of you who are viewing virtually. I got to pause for a moment. I know you didn't ask me this, Casey, but Jay, you blessed me. Experience healing myself from some of the things you shared. Yeah. But this is a powerful time. Cope 20 years here in the region of the Inland Empire, who has been engaged in faith-rooted, faith-based 501c3 organizing, intentional power building in several spaces: criminal justice reform, education reform, civic engagement, and health access here in the region of San Bernardino and Riverside County. This is an important time for us as it even relates to what you spoke of earlier, Casey, of declaring racism a public health crisis. And Felicia and I will tag team this together. This actually started back in 2006, between 2006, 2009, when we recognized as an organization through some of our criminal justice reform organizing that a number of men and women were returning from their time of confinement at that time with the Department of Corrections, better known as the Department of Rehabilitation now and Corrections. We're returning home with health conditions that they did not necessarily go to prison with, or extended health conditions that they even engaged or acquired once they were incarcerated. One day, a host of pastors were talking and were recognizing a number of women within their congregation. One in particular pastor had a conversation with a young lady in his congregation, entered into a relationship with a young man who spent some time away, contracted HIV, and the ball began to roll around a number of pastors who were having some of the same challenges. And out of that, first created in Los Angeles was the Public Health Reentry Task Force that began to work with public health in Los Angeles. And then ultimately here, we replicated the same process of our parent organization at that time, which was RCNO, and then locally, Los Angeles Metropolitan Churches at the time replicated the same process here in San Bernardino County, and was able to push the county to create the San Bernardino Reentry Public Health Collaborative. At that time, San Bernardino County was not even interested in addressing the needs of those who've been formerly incarcerated and the effects that they were experiencing when they were returning home. If I'm trying to remember the data, 8 to 10 times higher rates of HIV, hepatitis was off the Richter scale in this area. We discovered through some of our research that most of the communities around local county jail facilities in San Bernardino County, and it still even may be high today, had tremendous rates of syphilis, infection rates within those communities. And so the reentry collaborative around public health was created, and is now stands today a process for San Bernardino to address the needs of families and individuals who are returning home from local confinement, whether it's at a state, federal, or county level. It's now the San Bernardino Reentry Collaborative. So really, when we look at how we now arrived at declaring racism a public health crisis here in San Bernardino, we had already had a platform of where we had already been successful before. And once we saw, as you stated earlier when you did your introductory statements, Casey, the murder of our brother George Floyd in Minnesota signaled for us another opportunity to really organize ourselves. And we did it over a weekend. We text all of our leaders and say, look, we need to show up at the County Board of Supervisors and make a statement. And that statement was to push them to declare racism a public health crisis here in San Bernardino County. And Felicia, if you want to chime in and talk about really the importance of why that's for this region.
Yeah, I think it's, thank you so much. Again, it is an honor to be part of this conversation. I think it's important to understand the context where we are. We are in a relatively conservative region with a deeply rooted history of white supremacy. We are also prison town, and so you know we certainly are in a climate where policing and over policing really has a tremendous impact, and certainly mass incarceration has a tremendous impact on the communities in which we serve. And so, you know, everything that has been shared by our presenters shows up in our community. We see it, we know it. our members experience that. And then we also have the additional sort of burden of regional inequity. And that shows up in terms of access points, access to healthcare. When we started the work around the public health reentry work, we also recognized that our region was struggling with access to health facilities. And as
Yes.
more of our communities move further, into the high desert area where there's even greater disparities, the health, greater access challenges, the health disparities are greater. So it was really important for us to really try and get a county-wide focus on how we address this. And to be honest with you, the work, we still have a lot of work to do. We still have a lot of education to do. We still have a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place. But this declaration is certainly the beginning of that. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. I mean, I want to continue this thread of the conversation that really Jay started talking about sort of the village, right? The community building aspect of that. Dr. Bath talked about the community and individual interventions, that are needed to help sort of heal the harm in a lot of ways. Jay, I want to ask this question first to you, and then I'm going to take it over back actually to Felicia and Reverend Casey. And then I actually want to ask a similar question of Stephanie too. Your story, Jay, was so moving, and it's obviously so much a part of your work. But I'm curious if you could share with the audience, how does your lived experience not only shape the work you do, but how you do the work? The how of the work in a culturally competent way, I think, is as important as the what of the work. If you could just share a little bit of how your lived experience informs your how. And I want to ask Reverend Casey and Felicia to speak a little bit about that as well, specifically about the community and individual interventions. Jay, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Casey. And yes, you bring up a great point about my lived experience is a big part of my identity. And how that informs my work now, it's not only an academic lens, but also a direct service lens, a lived experience lens, and also all the things that I have learned that I have done wrong. I always try to remember this, and I always try to remember. I was gonna say and talk about this quote, and I love Chuck Palahniuk. If you are readers out there, you probably know, Fight Club. Anyway, he's a really great writer. And the quote he has, and it states, I'm the combined effort of everybody I have ever known. But to me, I'm the combined effort of everybody I've had a connection with. I've had to learn these things, and so I try to really pick the pieces of these different experiences and different spaces, and I really try to apply. And that's something I learned at UCLA too. It's like, how are you going to apply what you're learning and then modify it? And that's the key piece here, is we learn about these concepts, we hear about them, but we have to modify them because there's no one size fits all. And it has to be very specific to not just now, if we really want to be strategic, not just to district, region, but perhaps even neighborhood. And so how that influences me is also, I remember my pain, struggle, and things that have infuriated me, but I also take in all the wise men and women and individuals that really kind of show me different things. And I try to remember also that I am only but one voice, and my experience is only relevant to me. And so it's not going to be the same to my fellow, individual next door, let's say, even. And so I really try to remember that. And as I can see, and one of the things I said before too, is I'm sharing with all of you, some of the conversation findings that I had with individuals, and they notice some of these things as well. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. And
Thank you. Sam, Felicia, and Felicia, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about this notion of community and individual interventions, and tie it, if you will, for me, to the concept of weathering that we heard Dr. Bath talk about. What is the role of community-based organizations, COPE in particular, from your own sort of lens? What is the role that you've played in helping Black communities in particular to weather?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And thank you for even referencing weathering. And I don't think we actually knew that that was an official term when we just have to figure out how to survive. So thank you for calling it and giving it a name. But, you know, I think there is just one, the ability to be in community with each other, recognize that we have shared lived experiences, and that we are building power together is really, and of course our faith becomes a secret sauce for us for helping us both collectively and individually sort of weather through a number of systemic oppressions. But I think the other piece that is so critical to being able to corral that energy and into significant change is really demanding that we don't that our voices, as you talked about, our lived experiences inform what happens in policy and practice. And that becomes really for us the lever to see something meaningful happen. That was what we had to insist on to move the county to actually embrace the needs of formerly incarcerated persons. We know that we have to still do that and insist that our voices be at the table, because we can't expect the system to correct itself. And certainly it takes something extra in us. It takes that urgency of community. It takes what we hear, what we feel, what we experience every day to push past those gatekeepers who don't want to solve with community. They actually believe they already have the answers, and we push back on that really hard. You cannot possibly have the answers because you don't know all of the hidden hurts there. You don't know all of the systemic barriers, the policies you put in place that create that. I hope I'm answering that, but those are, you know, we certainly think that being in community with each other really gives us the capacity to weather through these moments, and provide a sense of hope, actually, that we can create something better for our communities when we do it together.
Sam, did you want to add on to that? If not, I can go ahead, please add on to it.
She knocked that out of the park, but I just must chime in on that weathering piece, because I think, you know, it really now gives voice to even what we as a lived experience never knew that's actually what it was. And the pressure that we feel, not only as Blacks living through this experience, but the pressure we feel to sort of come up with our own panacea outside of those who actually caused the injury. Now having to sit at the table and really create narrative and shape narrative for them adds to that weathering, because trying to explain why we respond and why further now, you know, even as Jay said earlier, causes you to re-experience trauma that has been long-standing.
Yeah, and I want to just add on and chime in and you know, forgive me for taking a little bit of you know, extension here with you all, because I know you so well. I want to also add on to this notion of mental stress, you know, and you know, the mental stress that gets compounded when you have leaders like, you know, yourselves that are on the front lines, that are not sort of hidden in the shadows, and the kind of backlash, you know, that comes with your courageous leadership, you know, in a region that is, you know, highly conservative, openly white supremacist in many ways, and the kind of weathering that needs to happen in order to just protect you on a physical level, you know, of understanding that and having the kind of nuance and the kind of sensitivity to understand, for example, that Reverend Sam leads a church in the region. And, he's very public, about his advocacy and, social injustice. And that causes you all as an organization to have to think about his personal security and make investments in his personal security, because there are stresses that come with courage. And I think it's important for those who are in the audience and funders to understand that these are the considerations that organizations on the ground are having to make when you have leaders who are courageous, that there is backlash to that courage and they need physical protection. So I wanted to just make sure to integrate that as an important part of weathering as well.
Yeah, it absolutely.
And to that point, Casey, not to be so vulnerable, but I don't know if you can see what that says.
Firearm safety permit.
It has forced me. It has forced me to do that because of being attacked verbally at the County Board of Supervisors meeting, and having received one or two personal phone calls to my house.
I mean, these are the real things.
Thank you for lifting that.
Yeah, these are the real things. Stephanie, I want to turn it to you and talk a little bit about this learning journey, that the foundation is on. Specifically, what have you learned since you launched your birth equity work in 2019? That's either confirmed your thinking or challenged your assumptions. And what do you want funders to know, to learn from what you learned?
It's a great question. We're definitely still learning, and I think we always will be. But I can offer a few thoughts. First of all, stating the obvious, what we've learned or confirmed is that the work is really hard. We knew going in, and that has been confirmed, that we need to listen to and fund those being impacted who are closest to the issues. I think I had the honor of hearing Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative speak once, and he emphasized the importance of, quote, getting proximal, that funders must get proximal, and that has always stuck with me, and it's very true. I think another thing that I have learned along the journey, again, in the humility vein, is that even as a funder, if you think you have thought through every angle and you have done every vetting that you could possibly imagine with every angle on the project, and you've even funded a planning grant to test out the team and that's going to work together, and you're thinking through the issues with them and all of that, even if funding streams everyone thinks are equitable and all of that, you still can hit substantial problems, as we did in one big effort that we led. And that is really because, as my friend Dr. Jan Murray Garcia told me once, that the closer you get to equity, the harder the work becomes, because that's really where the rubber meets the road on who's going to give up what, who's willing to share what, who's willing power, whatever the things are. And that is again, another pearl. The closer you get to equity, the harder the work becomes. That I just think is incredibly true. And then a couple last things. You have to really be an active funder. And I don't mean that I have to explain that a little bit in a sense of, I don't mean actively like mucking around in the communities, that the community-based organizations that you funded to hopefully do what they do best. I don't mean it in that way. I mean when things when things that you funded are hitting up against other systemic challenges, and I gave the example of universities during my talk, and I don't mean to pick on universities. We fund a lot of university work, and it's fantastic, and we want to support Black scholars at universities. But just one example, that universities are not as equipped as one might hope to really be engaged in community-oriented work. And by that, I mean cutting checks swiftly to community-based organizations, purchasing large quantities of gift cards to be able to pay people who participate in focus groups. We're 2 for 2 now with 2 major universities in this state, one public and one private, that are simply not equipped to do this kind of thing. And we have to think through with them, how can we help them get equipped? Because hopefully there will be more of this kind of work in the future. And lastly, you have to regroup and rethink, even if it's painful for your philanthropy, if things aren't going well, and you have to be willing to own things that aren't going well that you may have helped put in place, and to correct them. And those are my pearls for now, and I'm sure I'll have a lot more.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Dr. Bath, I want to bring a question to you. You talked in your presentation about wear and tear on the organs. And I want to ask this question really in the context of the shocking news of the death of actor Chadwick Boseman, who died from colon cancer at the age of 43 after battling the disease that he'd been diagnosed with 4 years earlier at the age of 39. I think the traditional recommendation for screening for colon cancer is 45 or 50 years old. Clearly, that was too late for him. And so my question really is, what do the kind of questions that his death prompt in the public health system, or should they prompt in the public health system, about how to factor in racism when it comes to recommendations for screenings?
So, one thing that I think that as, and I'm here as a healthcare provider, as a child and adolescent and forensic psychiatrist, but physicians are not trained in assessing for discrimination. And that is one of the most potent, we're saying, racism is a public health issue, then we need to be thinking about when we are interacting with folks, we're not really assessing what their everyday discrimination is like, feels like. And I think that matters in terms of thinking about types of interventions to apply. And so I would say going upstream and naming, these experiences, because many people go to the doctor and no one's asking about racism, which we know is happening everywhere for a lot of people. And so part of that is just really understanding there's some measures that can be used. So there's like the everyday discrimination scale, or looking at perceived discrimination. And we know that their health effects directly related to that. And so we're not screening for that in general. So I would start there and really, recognizing, just as we ask, patients about housing and food insecurity, I think that that's going to be important, and sort of thinking about different types of allostatic load and weathering. I wanted to make a comment based on something Reverend and Felicia said around what struck me as the racial battle fatigue of being in the position to do this work, feeling weathered ourselves, but having to sort of engage, and how to sort of protect against that. That's, I think, an ongoing challenge. And so part of, if you're having an assessment with someone and you're seeing that they're scoring high on everyday discrimination, how will you think about wellness for that person? Because definitely we know that the coping of discrimination does break down the body in different ways. I don't know specifically in terms of Chadwick, like in terms of his actual case and how his colon cancer came, but we do have more morbidity, more mortality, less access to screening. We see that weathering cuts across class, just as birth equity or inequity outcomes. So it doesn't matter if you have like 10 degrees, or what your class status is, you're, as a Black body, you're going to be at risk, and you're already going in to it with broken down, cellular, systems at the cellular level. And I want to be hopeful. And so I don't mean that to sound dispirited, but I think that there are ways in which that we as a community need to sort of prioritize wellness, and that will be, taking care of ourselves, which is hard. And we're not socialized to, there are social ways that we're doing that, but I think that those ways aren't highlighted in media and portrayal. And then we have so much negative imaging that's really dehumanizing that it's hard to necessarily be tapping into what Girl Trek talks about as Black joy, And so I think we need to find our own Black joy and embrace it.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience, and I'm actually going to ask each of you to respond to it and each give, if you will, no more than 90 seconds or so response, because we want to get to some wrap up. I have a final question that I want to ask each of you. But the question from the audience is really, you know, in a world where there is so much need, you know, how do you go about prioritizing where you focus your voice, where you focus your mission, where you focus your vision? And each of you are coming at this from a slightly different angle. So Stephanie, you're looking at it from the, you know, healthcare system. Sam and Felicia, you're looking at this from the community perspective. Jay, you're looking at this from mental health, as is Dr. Bath. So from your vantage point, you know, how do you go about prioritizing in a world where there is so much need? Jay, we'll start with you.
Question. And, you know, I can really talk about what the work I'm doing now with the Department of Mental Health Strike Team and the UCLA Public Partnership for Wellbeing. And, you know, it has to be data driven. One of the things we're focusing on, as you all know, the portrait of LA gives a kind of a portrait of what LA neighborhoods and communities look like. And if you didn't know, over half of the population in LA County is struggling. And so a great way I think that we're looking at is how do we look at really the ones that are struggling the most and to also those struggling? And how do we really start with those key groups there? And I think not only data driven, but also how do we integrate even within those struggling and precarious cities and neighborhoods, how do we still invite them in? Because they still have to be leaders centered in their own healing and strategization, if that's a word, operationalization of what we want to do.
Felicia?
Yeah, I would certainly echo that same sentiment. We have the privilege of being a Black-led organization and sort of unapologetically focused on Black folks, but also recognize that Black communities face huge disparities. And I think ultimately we think, you know, when you prioritize the groups who have the greatest need and get it right for them, you get it right for everyone. So that whole notion of, you know, a rising tide lifts all ships really holds true when we get it right. And so I think that's how we think about prioritizing.
Mm-hmm. That targeted universalism notion. Yeah. Stephanie, and then Dr. Bath will give you the last word on this question, and I have a final question for each of you.
Yeah, I would agree with Jay on the data piece, that really knowing that piece and really keeping that top of mind. I think for us, given our small resources and big problems, the things about how do certain things start in one area and how can they spread and scale to other areas if they're successful. So really thinking about how do you plant seeds that can grow elsewhere. I think listening to those who are on the ground and in the community. And lastly, for the partnerships that have to be made again across to white-led organizations and et cetera, is to really start, I think the go where you're wanted phrase comes to mind. Start with those who really want to partner and learn in that way, and then work your way to the harder folks, because the work's already going to be hard with those who want to partner with you. So start there and try to have some successes and then go from there.
Thank you. Dr. Bath.
Sure. I was really struck by Dr. Chalecki's statement about the closer you get to equity, the harder the work is, and thinking about Audre Lorde, who talks about the master's tools will not fix the master's house. And so part of that, I think, is thinking about, I think we can learn from critical race theory that talks about centering the margins and really using those who are most marginalized as the voices, and we develop discourse from those voices. So their voices are the central point. Disability rights have a expression, nothing about us without us, and it really means centering our voices at the table. And I mean, this happens in whether you're in academia or philanthropy or community-led organizations, but just having us be sort of centralized and empowered in different ways. And it's going to create different types of structural outcomes.
So my final question, and thank you all, this has been such a rich conversation. I just appreciate the diversity of perspectives in talking about this topic. My final question, it piggybacks a little bit actually on the question that we got from our audience around sort of being able to decipher through needs. We're in such a responsive mode right now because of COVID, because of social unrest, you know, all the things. But projecting out, you know, 3 to 5 years from now, what should those in our audience be thinking about now to prepare us for the 3 to 5 years? You know, what should we be thinking about doing, preparing ourselves for, so that we don't regret not having done it in 3 to 5 years? Who wants to take it first? I'm not going to put you on the spot. That's a deep question. And I'm mindful that
Yes,
we
I'll
have
jump
4
out there.
minutes to wrap. So go ahead, Pastor.
60 seconds. Listen, actively participate in tearing down the institutional, structural systems that support racism. We've got to face our interpersonal issues that we have so that those who are dealing with internalized racism can find the wholeness and healing that we need in order to move forward. We need racists to become anti-racist. We need those who are institutional leaders who have privilege to participate in moving an anti-racist agenda, as well as tearing down the sentiment of an anti-Blackness across all segments of communities of color, and support the movement actively by supporting Black-led organizations. If there's any, you know, funders on viewing this, it's important now that you step up in a real way and support the liberation of those who are most affected by racism.
Who wants to have the last word on this question? What should we be paying attention to now that in 3 to 5 years we'll be thankful for if we do it right?
You know, I want to say something, and I think this might give an idea of what it might take, right, for this work to continue and progress. I am working now with my social worker that used to be my social worker when I was a child. I am now working at a place where I used to live, McLaren Hall, now coming McLaren Community Park. I am now a part of that committee. I am now a part of these different projects, right? Visionaries and people already doing the work. Safe Place for You, Home Village coming up, Opportunity House, all these individuals ready to succeed in life. It's going to require that partnership, and you will slowly start to see the changes. And the reason why I say this is because I never thought I would work with my social worker or be in the place that I really repelled from for years. Mm-hmm. But here I am, and the work is starting and continuing on.
So I want to thank you all. You know, there are a couple of, I think, significant themes, and we talked about, you know, public health, you know, racism, you know, public health, racism as a public health crisis, specifically with respect to mental health, some examples of that, some solutions that you all are working toward and driving toward. And fundamentally, you know, what I'm hearing really coming, you know, out of all of this is that there's some systemic work, some deep structural systemic work that has to happen. But it actually really begins at the personal level. It begins with being able to think about transforming relationships, the relationships that we have with one another, the relationships that institutions have with organizations on the ground, the relationships that scholars, you know, have with those with lived experience, is that we really have to think about how we transform relationships. And so that, to me, is another call to action, I think, for funders and those who are watching today, is what are the relationships that you have right now that need to be developed even further? And who's not at the table? Who are you not hearing from that you need to open space to be able to really fundamentally transform and have that sort of proximity, you know, that Stephanie talked about that comes from Brian Stevenson's work, to really sort of think about your network and your sphere of influence as funders and who's not there, and how to actually begin to transform the relationship so that we can transform structures and systems of oppression. So thank you. We are at time. I know that we will be making the handouts available, the presentations available, and a follow-up communication from SCG. I want to thank Tuli and her team again for creating such space ongoingly. And I want to make a plug for the SCG annual conference happening September 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. I hope I got those dates right, Tuli. And I really want to encourage you all to register for the conference where many of these kinds of conversations will continue to happen. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay well, stay whole, stay connected. Thank you so much. Be well, everybody.